Let's check in with Joseph Lindsley in Ukraine.
And after you and I talked on Friday, Kyiv was hit. The Russians hit a fuel depot or some kind of petrol station. Houses were burning.
Joe, little fucking Joe Lindsley.
Joe Lindsley is quickly becoming an American treasure in broadcasting.
Welcome to Ukraine Bank.
Good afternoon to you there in Ukraine, Joseph. Here's my question for you today. Do you think we have a situation now in Ukraine where Putin is not going to change anything? He's not going to change course until the outcome of our election here? And for that matter, do you wonder if Netanyahu is waiting to see who wins our election before he pulls back or changes anything in Gaza? What's your opinion on that?
Well, Bob, good afternoon from Kyiv. And, this is something that everyone here, I think, is thinking about to a large degree. But I think if you look, and I think probably Putin's aware of this, if you look behind the scenes a bit, it's not even, whoever's in charge, whoever wins the election is not the only determinant of the policy. And, it's, for example, so it's, we saw the other day, former President Trump was speaking at a rally, and these very inflammatory words he said. He was quoting something he said to NATO leaders when he was president. And he said, if you don't increase your defense spending, if you don't pay the promised 2% of your GDP for defense, which is a requirement of being in NATO, he said the very inflammatory words, I hope Russia invades you. And when you first look at that, all the headlines, ran with this saying, Trump is calling for Russia to invade Europe. And President Biden responded saying that Trump's words were appalling and dangerous. And on the face of it, that seems the case. But if you look closer, the White House, you could also argue maybe it's appalling and dangerous to say you're supporting Ukraine, to wave the colors of Ukraine and to use it to score political points. But still, we're approaching the 2-year anniversary, and after almost 2 years, to refuse to send long-range weapons, to refuse to give Ukraine permission to use, to hit targets on Russian soil. Ukraine is only allowed life support and not tools for victory. And, I think the press corps in the U.S. really does have to ask, who's in charge of the White House's strategy? By many accounts, it seems that it is Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor. And this policy of sort of appeasement and keeping Ukraine somewhat alive, but not making things possible for victory. And so we see Trump, has been urging NATO, for when he was president for years to wake up and to meet that 2% threshold. And it's pretty astounding that even after 2 years of war in Europe, 19 of 30 NATO member states, according to NATO information, are still spending below the promised 2% threshold. There's Germany and France and other nations are still, and Norway, for example, are still not spending that basic 2%, even though those are very wealthy nations with a lot of means. And this, I hear people in Ukraine say something similar to what President Trump said. They speak out of frustration sometimes. For example, when we see the protest of the truckers in countries like Hungary and Poland blocking the border with Ukraine, preventing supplies from entering the country, I hear people here, foreigners and Ukrainians, say something very similar to what Trump said out of deep frustration. Okay, fine. I hope Russia invades you. If Ukraine loses, you're next. And so I think we all have to look at that in that context a little bit and realize that this is bigger than just one person who's, becomes the president of the United States. There's a lot maneuvering behind the scenes, and the Russians like to manipulate this. And that's what I think what we saw in Putin's lecture. I don't think we can call it an interview, but his lecture with Tucker Carlson, his lecture to Tucker Carlson, Putin made it very clear that he doesn't believe Ukraine should exist, but he also believes in this idea, the Russian hegemony. And I think, we look at everything he said and his actions. Europe needs to be prepared, and I think it's more important to convince people, especially in the West and Washington, of why this fight matters than to worry about who's going to be president.
That reminds me, this text came in on Friday. I love this. Joseph should request an interview with Tucker Carlson. That would be interesting, wouldn't it?
I would actually like to have a conversation. And I know and I'm sure he remembers me. We knew each other back in the days of Fox News and the Weekly Standard. And, I saw a video from when Tucker was in Moscow right before he did his interview or before he listened to Putin's lecture. And he was praising Moscow, just walking around, and he had state media around him, because there's no free press. And he was praising the architecture. And I was thinking of this while, of Tucker marveling in Moscow, while on Saturday morning, I took a long run through the city of Kyiv just to clear my mind. And I realized, when we think of Moscow, we think of the Kremlin. The Kremlin is that is the symbol. That is the central public space in Moscow. And it's all about power and the government. And I realized, in Kyiv is a city that is about 200 years older than Moscow. Kyiv is a spiritual home of Slavic Christianity. Moscow didn't even exist when the city was founded in the 900s. And I realized that the three most publicly sacred places in Kyiv are not government buildings. In fact, I don't think I've even seen the presidential palace or whatever it's called there. It's not a prominent building, it's sort of tucked away. The three most prominent public spaces in Kyiv, it's a total opposite of Moscow, are about democracy and religion. So you have the Maidan, which is the ancient Persian Turkish word for public square. This vast square where the Ukrainians have their protest. That's the ultimate form of their government. Is when the people take to the Maidan to demand their liberties, as they do throughout, as they've done several times throughout since the fall of the Soviet Union. And then above the Maidan, there's a ridge, and on the ridge, you have the Green Dome Church of Saint Sophia, which is older than Moscow itself. It's more than 1,000 years old. That is really the spiritual home of Slavic Christianity. And then down the boulevard on that same ridge from Saint Sophia, from the green domes, you can see the gold domes of the church, the monastery of St. Michael the Archangel, which was destroyed by the Soviets and then rebuilt in the 1990s. And I realized that, the heart of Russia and Moscow is the Kremlin. And the heart of Kyiv is the Maidan, the center of democracy, which is more sacred to the Ukrainians than parliament. That's why the parliament building doesn't matter, because the real heart of it is the Maidan, the public square, and their tradition and religion. And that's what, so those two churches, St. Michael and St. Sophia. And then as I was running around Kyiv, you see the statue of St. Vladimir the Great, where he, at the very spot on the Dnieper River, where he became Christian and sort of introduced Christianity to this region. And then throughout the city, there are banners in English telling people that St. Michael the Archangel is both the patron and the symbol of Kyiv. And for someone like Tucker Carlson, who says he really believes in tradition and religion, those things don't really exist in Moscow. Even if you look at the stats in 2019, very few people go to church in Moscow. In fact, there are more churchgoers in the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine than actually in Russia, which is a much larger country. And so there is this deep sense of lived tradition and religion here that certainly Tucker Carlson's audience would appreciate. And here it's not polemical; it's just part of life. And especially as you go around the city and you see these reminders that Saint Michael, the Judeo-Christian symbol of good versus evil, that he's the protector and the symbol of Kyiv City. It's a reassuring thing a little bit when there's missiles and drones flying overhead. And then you see why people believe in this sort of spiritual protection. But that is so the symbols of Kyiv are about democracy and religion, and the symbols of Moscow are power and control and corruption. Just a geographic way to look at the divide between these two nations.
Mm-hmm. Friday after the show, I had the opportunity to chat with Joe on a Zoom call. And Joseph, you inspired me to dig into my roots a bit more. I mentioned that sometimes my dad would say he was born in Kyiv. Sometimes he'd say Odessa. And I was talking to my cousin, who reminds me that those two cities are about 200, 300 miles apart. And apparently, my dad and also my cousin's father, they were brothers, were born in the shtetl that was outside of those towns near a railroad station where our grandfather apparently was a station agent. So maybe that's why I got conflicting answers over the years, that he wasn't born in either of those two cities. Really, he was on the outskirts somewhere. So I know you're going to help dig into my roots.
And maybe he was in the railroad business and moving around. And yeah, well, I need to go to Odessa soon so we can investigate those routes. And by the way, Odessa, that lovely city by the sea, which I hope you get to see sometime soon, was hit by drones the past days. And after we talked, after you and I talked on Friday, Kyiv was hit. The Russians hit a fuel depot or some kind of petrol station. Houses were burning. While Americans were celebrating the Grammys and Super Bowl and all that, 2 years ago, celebrities cared, and now they're quiet about Ukraine. And in Kharkiv, there was a house of 5, and to read the account of how the family was burned alive, there was a newborn baby that the temperature was so high, the bones, the whole baby, everything turned into ashes, unidentifiable, and you could find the mother and 2 sons in the bathroom, burnt to death. So this horror and evil is still continuing while the world kind of moves on.
Yeah, terrible. I mean, after talking to you, I almost feel guilty going on with my weekend of a Super Bowl party and so forth, because I know what you're going through over there. All right. Till tomorrow, Joseph. Thank you, as always.
Till tomorrow. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for introducing Ukraine on your social media pages. That's very important, that much more people can get more information about the situation here and how everybody can help Ukraine to stay stronger and to save all the world.
Что он сказал?
Well, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?
Come on now. Oh, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?